Guys, welcome back. I have Coach Henry Torano with me, and when we were chatting about what we really wanted to talk about, something came up kind of to both of us. I was really curious to hear how Henry takes athletes through movement technique progression, especially when they start having to perform under fatigue. And he immediately came back and goes, dude, you can't do that in one call. So we had to kind of break this thing up into a couple of different calls. So this conversation today is going to be mainly based on strengthening the parts of movement and technique. And then secondarily, we're really going to hit on the essentially levels of fatigue. And I'm going to have Henry explain these pieces more specifically. But let me say this to start. This is going to assume that you don't have any major movement restrictions. So Henry, first and foremost, can you kind of just tell people what you mean by no movement restrictions so that we're all on the same page to start?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a big key there. Without trying to get too technical, that just means that we performed an assessment, whatever it is that coaches are using, and we deem these people eligible or qualified to start working on set movements, whether it be gymnastics, only lifts, or whatever it is that we're trying to improve the skill on.
Really quickly, what are some of the main movement restrictions that you might see that would cause you to pause?
So if we're talking about gymnastics, we definitely want to look at, assess the shoulders. Scratch test would be an immediate one. Core stability and postural endurance would be one of the other basic ones that comes to mind. If we're talking about, dynamic lifts, there's a bunch of them, from movement restrictions to even if the person knows how to move, do they know how to hip hinge? Can they squat? I mean, flex the knees and the hips at the same time. Can they get deep enough? How are their hips? How is their dorsiflexion? How is their front rack position, overhead position, etc.?
I think it's interesting. There are, it's like we're not competing in this world of just posting a movement and talking about the movement, because I think that's been done forever. I think perhaps a more interesting question is, if you can visualize the movement, why can't you do it? So if you don't have movement restrictions, and if you theoretically understand how the movement should be done, why can't one do it? And I think that's part of the, what we're going to start talking about today. So the first piece I wanted to hit on, Henry, is, can you explain to people what you mean by needing to strengthen the parts of the movement?
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you mentioned what you just mentioned before, because that's usually my go-to when I see, especially in remote settings, when I see videos of people trying to execute a particular movement, and I go like this.
Yeah.
Right? And my first go-to is, okay, dude, so this, here's a couple still shots of you, and here's a couple still shots of how it should look, right? And that's our starting point. Some people know, and they'll come out and say, oh, that, like, my cleans are terrible, they look terrible. Some people are like, oh man, I didn't even know how it was supposed to look. So whatever the case, I think that's the first step to, give some context to the person. It's like some visual idea of this is how it's supposed to look. Once you know that, and you still can make that happen, it's just a motor issue, right? Most of these movements that we're talking about are dynamic, which means they happen fast, and our brain needs to be trained to get into those positions that fast.
So well, let me ask you this first. By percentage, and just kind of wing it with me for a second, how many people move pretty well under light load and pretty terribly, not terribly, but poorly as the load gets heavier? Is that the general problem that you see nowadays, or is it just bad movement across the board?
I'd say it's a pretty low percentage these days. Granted, our clients have already been in the game for a little bit. They've done some type of training and have a little experience. So I could normally start seeing technique deficiencies even under light loads. Of course, that all gets magnified when you add intensity, and intensity is both load and rate of contraction.
Okay, so if it's getting worse as the weight is going up or the intensity is going up, and you're talking about strengthening the parts, break that down for me. What does that generally mean to you? And let's use an example. Let's use a clean, let's just say a power clean as an example. And let's also say a muscle up. Like, what are some of the things that you're doing to strengthen the parts of those movements to increase the likelihood of success when intensity gets high?
Yeah, so first part, of course, is going to be performing an assessment of that particular movement. So where do I think that things are going wrong? Or in many cases, there's a lot of spots where it's going wrong, but what do I want to attack first? Is it, setup position? Is it initial pull off the ground? Is it, second or third pull? Is it pull under, jumping forward, jumping too far back, trying to catch too high, knees forward, right? So there's a lot of things that could go wrong there. So the first thing is, what do I think is the number one priority that will give the client the most bang for their buck the fastest? And my first criteria there is, are they not safe performing the movement? So in the power clean example, I'm looking how it looks off the ground. So should this person even be pulling off the ground for one? If we're talking about the muscle up, again, a lot of moving parts. Is it the kip? Does it look like they're staying tight from the core? Are they trying to scorpion the kip? I'm sorry. Can they get up there, or are they just catching too low? Can they not get out of the dip? Do they not know how to transition? Is it a grip issue or a hand issue with the hands? Even equipment, actually, in the particular case of the muscle ups, are the rings too long, too wide, or too narrow? We've seen that happen several times where that slight adjustment improves them dramatically. But again, it's identifying what can I do that will help them the most, the fastest.
I think that that's such a good statement. It just makes me think of principally habit, right? Like, you can't do three things at once until you can do one thing. And I think I see these folks who are constantly trying to go, okay, when I pull the bar off the ground, do these 5 things. And then once the bar hits the knee, do these 4 things. And then as I'm starting to drive through the hips, I got to do these things. And you're like, there's no way that that's actually going to happen when that bar starts to come off of the ground. So how do you recognize that you are improving the priority parts? Is it by look? Is it like, how would you say, yes, we are making improvements on that?
Definitely by look. Once you break it down into parts, it's a lot easier to identify that. So, back to the clean. If we're looking at pull off the ground, that's very easily assessed by reviewing video and comparing, and then even performing. There are individual benchmarks for each one of those components separately. So, in the muscle up, does this person need to get higher onto the rings? So let's work on strict chest to rings. How many can you do unbroken? 3. And then we'll test that again, and you're up to 7, so forth and so on. So that gives us an idea of that particular part improving. Of course, that's only parts. We also kind of want to look at, well, that's fantastic that you improved all the parts. How is it transferring? Because that's also very important. That's the end goal of that plan.
Yeah, and I think too, I want to make sure that I reiterate this. Henry is saying that essentially you already know the movement, right? You don't have major movement restrictions. You have a starting point. Clearly, if somebody had no concept of how to do this, we're not loading up a clean and having people try to figure it out. So we're building up habit to strengthen the individual parts. We are testing certain parts of that depending on the client. And then we're putting it back into the entire movement to make sure that the movement sounds sometimes really effective. So anything else that you want to hit on strengthening the parts, Henry?
Yeah, great. A good note to keep in mind is you can actually be working on all of the parts as well. Right? We can prioritize the chest to rings on the pull up, but for the muscle up, I'm sorry. But we can also be practicing transitions in low fatigue settings. We can also be practicing deep ring dips with a pause at the bottom. So you can actually be working on all of the parts to improve it. So yeah, you don't have to get stuck on only deadlifts or only chest rings as you practice them. And then another point, just to add to, to the conditions that you mentioned, we're also talking about improving muscle ups, not going from I can do 2 pull-ups to try to do muscle ups. This is somebody who can do a muscle up or or a few, and we're trying to make them better or clean the technique up a little bit.
Okay, perfect. So one more quick question off of that. You mentioned that you do some additional movements, perhaps in a lower fatigue setting. What happens if somebody really needs technical improvement in multiple movements? Are you doing the same type of a thing where you are prioritizing, here's the number one movement based on sport, based on need, and then within that, you're kind of breaking down and saying, okay, these parts need to be improved. Here's what I'm going to do with, CNS, and here's what I'm going to do with lower fatigue. Is that about right?
Yeah, and the answer to the first question is yes. I will implement skill work for a variety of movements. Of course, that's highly dependent on where they're at the more advanced movements. And what I mean by that is, if you can do 4 or 5 muscle ups, but your butterfly chest to bar are a little bit iffy, right? I could potentially work on chest to bar technique and muscle ups on a different day. But if we still need to get you to improving strict pull-up work or dynamic pull-up or chest to bar work, then that would preempt muscle-up practice. Just because I'm putting my money on the back that if you can do twice as many chest to bars, you can at least do 1 additional muscle-up. By the time you get that improvement there, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well said. Okay. So now here's something I'm really interested in talking about. You were mentioning the layers of fatigue. Can you explain what you mean within the context of movement technique?
Yeah, and that's the number one mistake, I believe, by the public. I can't do muscle ups, therefore I'm just going to put muscle ups into every single workout, right? And it's completely the opposite, to that. If you're not good at a particular movement, you need to pull it out of all other components of fatigue. That means outside of mixed modal and into, up to the front end of your workouts where your CNS is freshest. Your body is fresh coming off, 24 hours at least of rest, or even a half a day for those that do doubles. But it should be structured front end so that you can actually practice a skill with the right intent, which is skill. If any of the other components that are put in, within that piece are taking away from your ability to perform that skill, or taking away from your concentration, then it stops being a skill and it starts becoming endurance within the movement. And you're basically starting on the 3rd or 4th step rather than pulling back and going back to basics.
And just so if people aren't quite sure, essentially what Henry is saying is you have CNS, central nervous system. You only have so much aggressive firing that your central nervous system can send into your body. And if you burn that out through fatigue work, it's gone, right? Like it doesn't just come back right away. Now, certainly some people have more drive than other people, but if you burn that out, it's far harder to teach your body how to do the movement efficiently. And I think you and our other Big Dogs coaches and James would all say, if you do movements under fatigue poorly, you actually learn how to do that movement poorly under fatigue. So you're not getting better per se, you're just learning how to do it poorly. So I think when people see high-end CrossFit athletes doing reps really beautifully tired, it's because they've done so many reps with no fatigue, then some fatigue, then a lot of fatigue effectively. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And one thing I tell my clients, and this is no scientific evidence behind it, but bear with me. For every bad rep, you need 20 perfect looking reps to kind of erase that bad one. So if you've performed 1,000 bad pull-ups, we need 20,000 of those puppies to look perfect. So how could you possibly make those 20,000 contractions look good? It's probably doing 5 sets of 3s for a good while, instead of trying to, fan it out every other week.
And how, for a client that either has never thought about that or just is struggling to wrap their head around that because they've been training in such a different way, have you worked with clients on almost like a mental approach to this thing too, to help them be okay doing it that way?
Yeah, every one of them that we've implemented this with. Yeah, that's a huge part of it. Number one, the delivery needs to be decisive. So I'm not suggesting that this be done. It's like, we got to do this to improve your, fill in the blank. And the way we're going to do it, it's going to look like this. You're going to do, for A, every Monday and Thursday, it's going to be 5 sets of 5 pull-ups. And then next week, we're going to do 6 sets of 5 pull-ups. And so forth and so on, building sets up to whatever the functional volume for that particular movement is. And then 8 weeks from now, we're going to retest AMRAP.
Yeah, and really quickly, Henry, functional volume, that's basically what they might need to do in a competitive workout for their level. Is that about right?
Correct. For whatever the athlete's goal or purpose is, you want to look at what the competition they're preparing for and more or less the amount of volume that's required to express those contractions in those settings, and you want to build them up to that. So you build them up in low fatigue, then in light aerobic fatigue, then in complementary fatigue, non-complementary fatigue, eventually to aerobic settings.
Gotcha. And complementary just means what?
Pistols to go with your pull-ups. So 2 movements that one doesn't fatigue the other. And then non-complementary would be, well, the opposite. So perhaps snatches and pull-ups where, you still have rotation of the shoulders, grip work, etc.
Awesome. Henry, this was a great first talk. I'm excited to do this again with you in a couple of weeks. Anything to leave folks with when they're thinking about movement for the next couple of weeks?
Yeah. Look at what the goal is. So how is it supposed to look? And just be honest in where you're at. Yeah, and then just pull it out of the fatigue scene and work on it nice and easy in a skills environment.
Awesome. Henry, thanks so much, man. We will see you next time. And everybody listening, we will see you guys next time.
Oof.